Welcome to the Salt of the Earth podcast. I'm Jonathan Cobb, and this is my co-host,
Thomas Pope.
Yeah, so...
We're kind of starting a podcast thing. It's going to be different than our other videos in that our other videos are a little bit more researched and scripted, and this is our aim for this anyway, is for it to be much more of a back and forth kind of discussion-oriented thing where we maybe go over some of the same stuff, but it's like...
a little bit longer form. We have a bunch of different... Hopefully we'll get into more stuff, talk about other people's work as well, and go into books maybe a little bit, like Christian books, other things we find inspirational. So I might plagiarize a little bit more in this podcast.
It's not plagiarizing if you mention the author.
Yes.
And maybe even eventually, who knows, have guests or something.
Yeah, that'd be great. Different people from our church that are in ministry of some sort, or maybe other people that have similar ideas as us.
Or very different ideas.
That's
also good. So, we'll just kind of be talking about probably a few different small topics, each time, maybe going into some of the videos we recently made, It'll be different every time, basically.
Yeah.
So, we have a couple things that we were kind of planning on talking about, and Jonathan knows more about them than I do.
Yeah. So, kind of like we have a basic underlying theme for this podcast, and that is the prosperity gospel. And I had one video that I like that I've transcribed onto this cheat sheet. And also we have a book that we're going to read from later. But let me quote from you from the video. It's like a 4-minute video from, the guy's name is Wayne Cardario, I think.
And it's a video that's been around for a while. I think the date on it was like 2010 or something. But
yeah.
But Jonathan had seen it and he showed it to me, and it was definitely kind of a very inspirational thing that, it's good. So So we're gonna read the transcript of it, and then we're just gonna talk about it. So
yeah, and this is not word for word. I was in a hurry, so I just kind of try to consolidate a little bit.
We'll give you the link so you can watch it. The guy in the video will probably do a better job.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can watch the actual video, and you can see what he looks like. Okay, we go to China from time to time to train leaders. And this time, we brought up 22 leaders from the Hunan province. They rode 13 hours on a train to get to a hotel, and came up 2 by 2 in these elevators so as not to draw any attention. And they got to the hotel room. 22 of them sat in the hard floor with no air conditioning. And when you teach in China, you start at 8 in the morning and you don't get down until 5 at night. I asked them, if we get caught, what will happen to me? They said, you'll get deported and we'll go to prison for 3 years. I asked, how many of you have been to prison for your faith? 18 out of 22 raised their hands.
It's a good ratio.
Yeah, that's basically all of them. These were all church leaders. They counted. I asked them, how many people do you guys oversee between the 22 of you? And they counted it up, and it was a little over 20 million. Of course, China is a big country, so.
But still,
it's
22 people.
Yeah,
still a lot.
It's crazy because, obviously, as we're reading, the church in China is persecuted. When we started the study, I realized that some of them had much of the Bible memorized. When I asked the lady, where did you memorize so much? She said, in prison. You have much time in prison. People bring in scriptures written on pieces of paper, and we memorize off of that. Won't they confiscate the paper, though? Oh, yes, she said. That's why you memorize it as fast as you can, because even though they can take the paper away, they can't take what's hidden in your heart. At the end, I asked them, how can I pray for you? They said, in America, you can gather like this whenever you want. Can we pray that we'll be just like you? I said to them, I will not do that. You guys took a train 13 hours to get here. In my country, if you had to drive more than an hour, people don't come. You sat on a wooden floor for 3 days. In my country, if people have to sit more than 40 minutes, they leave. You didn't have air conditioning. In my country, if it's not padded pews and air conditioning, people don't often come back. In my country, we have an average of 2 Bibles per family. We don't read any of them. You memorize scriptures from pieces of paper. I will not pray that you become more like us, but I will pray that we just become just like you.
A lot of things to pull apart from that, and especially the last bit.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought because on one side, of course, we don't want people to suffer, but on the other side, if it results in a greater good, it's
Well, I mean, persecution. It looks really bad. It sounded really bad. It's definitely not fun, but at the same time, the apostles were told to, well, the apostles, just Christians in general, are told to rejoice in sufferings, and obviously you can see from when you look around the world, a lot of times it is places like China or something where they either just received the gospel or it's very heavily like censored and discouraged or even just flat out illegal. It's usually those places that have some of the strongest believers. And here in America, we're kind of just softening.
yeah, it's hard to say out loud that think suffering is good because it's just an inherently repulsive idea to say that. But
And also, I think even if we were to say it, it's like, well, come on, we've never really experienced like genuine suffering. Just like when a kid says they're starving or something, they don't actually know the meaning of real starvation, because it's never been more than a few hours since they've had a meal here, usually. Not always, but one thing I think that's really cool is the memorization they did, and obviously they do it because they don't have very many Bibles, and just their solution to that was to internalize the scriptures, to have them inside so that no one could take them, and even to the point where they're kind of smuggling in pieces of paper into prison so that the person who's in prison can memorize them.
it kind of shows that they valued the scriptures way more than most people in America do. It shows because we've always had the scriptures. It's not hard to get access to it at all. It's super easy. But it would be interesting to see if it was hard to get access to it.
How hard would we try?
How hard would we try?
Yeah.
Because you never know.
We can have it on our phone, and I probably have like half a dozen copies in my apartment, and I know there's stacks of them here in cupboards and stuff.
Yeah.
And it's another thing. When we were reading this now, something I thought about was how it just kind of goes to show where if you remove all the distractions and you really focus on memorization or on just learning God's word and stuff like that, you can memorize entire books and stuff like that. Because in prison, obviously, they don't have a whole lot that they're focusing on, and they choose to focus on the thing that's most important, and they come out of it knowing a ton of scripture,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's probably they're memorizing about as fast as people could write it on paper, because obviously it's not very fast.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever watched, or not watched? Have you ever read The Hiding Place by Corrie Ten Boom?
I think my mom read it to me.
Oh, well, it's basically the same situation, except for it's Nazi concentration camps of people that are harboring Jews, and it's just...
Yeah, they're hiding in like their special cupboard thing or something.
Yeah.
I think.
And the last part of the book, they were in prison as well for doing that. And it was kind of went over the same ideas and a lot of suffering because she lost all her family in the camps.
Um, so moving on to that whole last section, and I guess I would really encourage you to watch the video actually, because kind of just the way that he says it, it's very impactful, kind of.
He's a good speaker. But.
Yeah, well, it does help to be a good speaker. But just, at the end of this, like 3-day, session of just teaching all day long, he asked them how he can pray for them. And they want to be able to worship in the open like we can here in America, but they say we want to be like you. His answer, which I think in the video he mentioned that at first it shocked them that he would say, no, I'm not going to pray about that. But the reasons he gives, they kind of they really highlight the difference between people in places like China, where for them Christianity is a dangerous thing, but they want to do it anyway, and places like here in America where people just kind of fall into a pattern in doing it. Because things like sitting on hardwood floors for 8 hours a day, or no air conditioning, compared to here in America, we have our nice padded pews, and people get impatient if sermons go to 40 minutes. I know some churches where they've shortened it to like 20 minutes.
Yeah, and this thought kind of reminds me of like Bible camp. It's like Bible camp, but it's your whole life, and it's way harder. Because kind of the idea of Bible camp is or at least some Bible camps, is that you don't have like all the nice amenities sometimes, and you get to just spend all your time learning about the Bible. And even most extreme Bible camps you don't spend 11 hours a day, but
you have you have two church services, several classes, maybe some activities. But the idea is, you're doing a lot more than you normally would.
But these people do it as much as they can. They hunger and thirst after it.
Mm-hmm. And it's something that's very convicting, because I think about it myself. I, like I said, I have multiple Bibles, or I have it on my phone. It's always within reach, but I'm not always very good at actually reading it. It's kind of there. I'm never good at having like a consistent habit, or having that level of thirst to where I don't need a habit. I just do it I guess that's kind of habit, but I just do it all the time,
Yeah, well, kind of what my opinion as far as like, the more you read the Bible, the more you should get a sense of the need for the Bible. And it's not just reading, it's applying to your life. And if you actively read and apply it, in my opinion, it should be a point where you're not doing it out of habit, even it's out of need. I mean, I think that's the goal.
Well, it just kind of becomes a part of you.
Yeah.
In a way.
But I think if you were reading and didn't really try to apply it to your life, it wouldn't have as big of an impact, because it wouldn't be as.
It's I think to like the verse in Revelations, I forget. I think it's in the first 3 chapters. I think the first chapter actually, where it's like, blessed are those who hear and do, or something like that. What is written in this book? Basically, the idea is, hearing is one thing, but the application, that's the next and the necessary step.
Mm-hmm.
But on that idea of like, if you read enough Bible, it just kind of becomes natural. It becomes what you want. Kind of, it becomes who you are. I've thought about this because there have been times before when I did really get into like reading it all the time, and it kind of changes the way you think, and even the way like your internal, dialogue, even the word choices you kind of use. It's kind of like if you've ever, something I noticed. Mm-hmm. It's like if you've ever like read like a Shakespeare book or something with a completely different like style of English or something, sometimes you'll start like thinking or talking a little bit more like that because you just kind of adopt the words. Like if you read enough of Paul's letters, you kind of start thinking more like Paul.
Yeah. Well, it comes down to like, there's, I don't remember the verse, but it's like has to do with dwelling on the scriptures, and thinking about it constantly. There's a verse about it. I don't remember.
In Joshua, meditate on them day and night or something.
Yeah. It's.
I had it memorized once.
Yeah, and memorization is also something that we should do. Yeah.
It's not as good when you forget it, but the gist is in there somewhere, right?
Yeah, and it's definitely helpful to, even if you don't know it word for word, at least you have the idea. That's.
I used to, when I was in Bible Bowl, I would memorize, like, my goal would be 10 verses a day. And
For like long-term memorization or short-term memorization?
it was fairly short-term, actually. Like I couldn't quote most of it now, but
Yeah.
but at least for the purpose of the time when I was doing that section of Bible Bowl, I would know it pretty well. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, it's a lot of memorization to do in some camps, and then I have many camps that I have no idea what I memorized.
Well, they give you like 45 minutes, and they expect you to do a list, and you get points if you do it, so you just do it, and then you dump it.
Yeah, it's a skill that you can develop from going to school.
I mean, you really only have to know it for like 5 seconds, and then you tell it to the person, and then you go to the next verse, and it's like, there's maybe a better way to do memorization, especially for like a activity or like part of a camp or Bible lesson or something. There may be a better way. I'm not sure what it is, but
Yeah.
there might be a better way.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a great video. Definitely recommend that you watch it. It's by Wayne Cordiero, and yeah, we'll leave a link to it.
Yeah.
It's only like 4 minutes long
It's very short.
and very, very impactful. So
Yeah.
more than we can make it.
So, this is an interesting story. So, I haven't read a book besides the Bible since I graduated high school. But then,
You should get an award for that.
which may not seem like a long time for some people, but for me it was. But my spiritual coach, I should say, is what I consider him at this point, told me that reading other books besides just the Bible is actually, even if they weren't Christian books, was beneficial for his perspective on the world, and he's recommended me do that as one of my activities. And it looks like we didn't silence our phones.
I didn't get the message. How do I do?
And I had been sent this book by a relative, and it had been sitting on my dresser for a few months. And I sense, well, if I'm starting to read, I should read this one first because it looks interesting. And I watched the movie of the sequel.
The movie of the sequel.
Yes, this is the sequel to the main book.
So what is the book?
It's The Case for Faith by Lee Strobel. It's pretty common, or even more common is The Case for Christ, also by Lee Strobel, which has a movie about it. And this is like the sequel to that. And it's The Case for Christ was basically had to do with making a case that Jesus did die on the cross and rose again. That was basically the gist of that book. And you did explored all sorts of evidence and talked to experts and looked at DNA, maybe. I don't remember.
So a lot of apologetics, basically.
Yeah, apologetics and science. It was more like mainstream, coming at it from a mainstream perspective. He was a journalist, so he wasn't like, he was coming at it from the mainstream, basically, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And when he writes this book, I believe he's already a Christian, but he still struggles with some things. And so
As we all do.
As we all do. Mainly, I after he writes the case for Christ, he's convinced that Christ died and rose again. But now this book is more about how God is, if God is still alive, kind of. Or if he's a loving God,
If he's still, use the word alive, active, kind of.
Yeah. Because there's a lot of people that will believe, okay, maybe Christ did come to earth, but where is he now?
Yeah, he's dead. He's asleep on the job, something like that.
He doesn't care anymore. We haven't seen a miracle in X number of years. Thomas, if you want to read this one as soon as I find my spot, since I read the last one. You know who, what's his name? The great preacher that was 50 years ago, what was it? Billy Graham. You know him, right?
I know of him.
And did you know that he had a friend named Charles Templeton?
I did not.
That started preaching on the same time as Graham, and people they were kind of like, and I think he might have converted Graham, maybe. And they were kind of like, went together. People expected they kind of expected Graham and Templeton will both be great preachers. But then Templeton ran into a situation where he started to doubt how there could be a loving God if there is such intense suffering in the world. And eventually that led him to partly fall away from the faith. The interesting thing was, as the interview points out, he still believed in God, or in Jesus, kind of. But it's kind of hard to explain. But let me find. So first. He first talks to Templeton, and then later he talks to this guy named Kraft. So the first part that I thought was interesting is the reason Templeton fell away is because of this, initiated from this picture he saw of a woman in Africa with a dead baby. It was like a sorrowful picture, and basically what happened is the baby had died of starvation, and it could have all been prevented with just a little bit of rain. And so basically Templeton's logic is that if all the woman needed was rain, God could have just given it to her, the baby would have lived.
I can see that.
And so the journalist, Lee Strobel, takes that argument and convinced that this other guy who had written a book about the prosperity gospel, or how there can be loving God in the midst of suffering. And he confronted Kraft with that argument, or Kreeft as his name is, with that argument. And here it is under a bear, a trap, a hunter, and God. You can read a page or so. There might be a stopping point at some point.
Okay. So just starting here?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought, is it possible to believe that there is a loving or caring creator when all this woman needed was rain? How could a loving God do this to that woman? Who runs the rain? I don't. You don't. He does. Or that's what I thought. When I saw that photograph, I immediately knew it is not possible for this to happen and for there to be a loving God. There was no way. Who else but a fiend could destroy a baby and virtually kill its mother with agony, when all that was needed was rain? And then I began, considering the plagues that sweep across parts of the planet and indiscriminately kill, and it just became crystal clear to me that it is not possible for an intelligent person to believe that there is a deity who loves. Any more?
Yeah.
So, I looked up from my notes. The professor's eyes were riveted on me. Facing him squarely, leaning forward in my chair for emphasis, I said in a rather accusatory tone, Dr. Kreeft, You're an intelligent person, and you believe in a deity who loves. How in the world would you respond to Templeton? Kreeft cleared his throat. First of all, he began, I'd focus on his words, it is not possible. Even David Hume, one of history's most famous skeptics, said it is just barely possible that God exists. That's at least a somewhat reasonable position. To say that there is at least a small possibility. But to say there's no possibility that a loving God who knows far more than we do, including about our future, could possibly tolerate such evil as Templeton sees in Africa, well, that strikes me as intellectually arrogant. That took me aback. Really, I asked? How so? How can a mere finite human be sure that infinite wisdom would not tolerate certain short-range evils in order for more long-range goods than we could foresee? He asked. I could see his point, but needed an explanation. Elaborate a bit, I prodded. Kreeft thought for a moment. Look at it this way, he said. Would you agree that the difference between us and God is greater than the difference between us and, say, a bear? I nodded. Okay, then. Imagine a bear in a trap and a hunter who, out of sympathy, wants to liberate him. He tries to win the bear's confidence, but he can't do it, so he has to shoot the bear full of drugs. The bear, however, thinks this is an attack and that the hunter is trying to kill him. He doesn't realize that this is being done out of compassion. Then, in order to get the bear out of the trap, the hunter has to push him further into the trap to release the tension on the spring. If the bear were semi-conscious at that point, he'd be even more convinced that the hunter was his enemy who was out to cause him suffering and pain. But the bear would be wrong. He reaches this incorrect conclusion because he's not a human being. Kreeft left the illustration. Let the illustration soak in for a moment. Now he concluded, how can anyone be certain that's not an analogy between us and God? I believe God does the same to us sometimes, and we can't comprehend why he does it more than the bear can understand the motivations of the hunter. As the bear could have trusted the hunter, so we can trust God.
Yeah, when I got to that chapter, I was kind of like, okay, what is Kreeft going to say? Because I've thought about this a lot too, personally, and that's basically pretty close to the exact argument that I would use if somebody asked me that. And so I was thought that was kind of cool. Thought that was kind of cool that was the argument he used.
The argument basically that, first of all, we cannot know what all God is planning, and second of all, since we can't know, it's possible that the bad things that are happening around us will lead to some greater good that we just cannot foresee.
Yeah. Well, basically, how I see it is there is the knowledge gap between us and God is huge. If you think about it mathematically, you could say, okay, if knowledge is based on time on Earth, or time accumulated, wisdom is knowledge accumulated over time. If you think about it that way, I've lived for 19 years. God has lived for infinity. So that's one way you can think of it. And by that logic, God is infinitely smarter than me, which is hard to comprehend because it's hard to comprehend infinite knowledge.
I was sure you were about to say it's hard to comprehend something smarter than me.
So that's one way you can look at it. So if there's nothing that we're infinitely smarter than here on Earth, we're not infinitely smarter than any animal. So, but there's many situations where you could do something to an animal that you thought would be absolutely awful, that we're actually not. And there is a much bigger knowledge gap between us and God and us and any animal. So that's kind of the same argument that Kreeft was making in the book. And I think it's an excellent argument.
It's definitely a thought provoker at the very least, because this question of suffering is really, when it comes down to it, something that everyone has to grapple with. That, well, you mentioned you'd grappled with it. I've thought about it. I've heard a lot of people, both Christian and non-Christian, who have struggled with this idea of how in the world can there be a God who loves us and wants the best for us, and yet life is so hard, there's so much suffering and pain. That question is something that everyone has to, in some way, either answer or ignore it. And
yeah.
and there are, I mean, I guess there are arguments for both sides, kind of. This is a pretty good argument for how it could be that, maybe those things can coincide. Maybe it's not an impossibility,
Yeah, good can come out of evil. That's one side of it. And I think there's another side of it, too. So, basically, the woman was mourning over the death of her baby. And we think, okay, how can anything be worse than death? And but the other side of it is that God does not think like we do. Death is not He has conquered death. So if you think about it that way, nothing that can happen to us on earth is actually matters. And so the suffering that happens to us on earth doesn't really matter at all as far as our eternal focus.
And the fact that it happens to us doesn't matter. I guess how we respond to it might matter, depending on...
Yeah, how we respond to it matters, but the suffering that we have here on earth is suffering, and God does care, but it's not... Death does not... There's no finality in death, and so we think if, like, Templeton was like, how can God allow this to happen? It's the worst thing that can happen. But it's really, if from God's perspective, it's really not. It's just a journey, or it's just a stepping stone, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the two arguments: is one, good can come out of evil, and two, what is actually evil in an eternal focus.
Mm-hmm.
Which are kind of similar if you think about it, but in light of eternity, what is actually evil? Or what yeah.
Is death itself evil?
Yeah.
It's an unpleasant thing from our focus, us being people that are used to everything ending, and people die, things wear out. Everything from our point of view is temporary. And so in that case, the end is kind of understandably seen as a bad thing. But step back for a moment, have more of an internal focus. The dying itself is not as important as the living, I guess, is how I would say. Is what you did before you died is more important than the fact that you died.
Mm-hmm.
Or the fact that you suffered. Because when it comes down to it, after death, there is an eternity in, one of two places, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
one eternity is much, much worse than anything that could happen to you on earth.
Yeah.
And one eternity is much, much better than the lack of suffering on earth.
Which, and that people use that as kind of the furthering of the questioning to, like, can a loving God do this? Is that there is, there is such a thing as hell, and they struggle to believe that exists, and that a loving God would actually send billions of people there if they didn't believe him, right? Believe in him. And so that's kind of a further point to why some people are skeptical about the existence of a loving God, is because not just the suffering here on earth, but the fact that this God that, Christians say is so loving, that he would send someone to hell,
Yeah, that is a little bit more difficult than the other one.
Because, there's no future from the hell, right? He's not sending someone to hell for someone else's good, and he doesn't do that. There's no, like, future good is like, you may not understand this now, but it'll work out in the end. Because no, it won't. And, this is definitely something that could be talked a lot about. Like, I know, or at least I think, we have plans on making, more full-length videos on this, because it is such an important topic. And like I said, it's something everyone has to kind of struggle with and figure out an answer one way or another,
Yeah. I guess that's weird, because I actually never really thought about that argument a lot. but that is as valid or more valid than this argument, or this.
Mm-hmm.
The suffering on earth is the suffering in hell.
So it's a hard thing.
Yeah.
And I know people who grew up in the church or something, but then I had a guy in some of my college classes there where he stopped being a Christian because the idea of eternity terrified him. Not the idea of a good eternity or a bad eternity, but eternity to him just sounded terrifying because it just goes on and on and on, and to him that was a terrible thing.
Yeah, that is something I've struggled with a little bit too. Is you when your life is I think especially if your life is good, you feel like you can play the game here down to earth, and we're getting good at this game, or this earth. But then if we win, we're just gonna put into a different game that we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of how I think of it. It's like, but I think in the suffering, or in when you're immersed in the love of Christ, it's like something that kind of, in those moments you can feel like the longing to be in heaven, even I don't know, it's weird. But
Mm-hmm. You know, there are definitely times when, it's a very genuine feeling of just like, man, I'm just ready for it. Just give me, I'm just ready for that rest. I'm ready to,
mm-hmm.
not have to deal with life anymore. Not. So from the perspective of like, it'll just be so good. I just can't wait,
Yeah.
And there have been times when I've, like sat down and envisioned it or something, daydreaming or while listening to a, certain piece of music or something, and it just helped me visualize it. And I just thought like, man, that would be so nice.
And reading Revelations.
Yeah. And the actual descriptions of the Bible that just give enough information to kind of be like, man, that does sound good, but not enough to be like, oh, I know exactly what it'll be like.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's definitely one of the reasons why reading books, in and out of, whether they're Christian books or not, is a good thing, because when you can, especially ones like this where it's actually, related to the topic of faith in Christianity, where you can read about the struggles and the questions that other people faced and how they overcame them or didn't overcome them.
Yeah, and a lot of the struggles that are going to be in here, I imagine some of them I'll never have thought of before, and it'll help to not only identify the struggle, but also identify their solution. If I already have that struggle, already have that issue in my life, or if I will have in the future, to already have thought about it is definitely going to be of value. And that comes from all books in general, or any experience, or from life, or learning from other people in general.
Mm-hmm.
You can learn about what struggles you may have in the future, or how to deal with ones that you already have through other people's experience.
There's a quote, I don't know what it's from, that I heard, I saw once, and it was really good, because the quote was something like learn from other people's mistakes because you don't live long enough to make them all yourself.
Yeah.
Is that kind of idea, is like, we could try to, brute force our way and try to resolve all of our problems on our own, but we're probably not going to do a very good job. And why not use help that other people have? And obviously, you've not even finished the book, I don't think.
I just barely got into it.
And there's, you've already been exposed to, several questions that, you found impactful, and also several kind of answers to those questions.
Mm-hmm.
And, your 1/8 ish
Yeah.
through a book, and there's so many books. It's also kind of interesting because just today I started listening to an audiobook, which is kind of on this topic of suffering. It's Something Needs to Change by David Platt, which I'd had for a while but hadn't listened to it. It's basically the same kind of thoughts where how can there be all this physical and spiritual need, and how can we help that, I guess. How can there be all this physical and spiritual need in the world, and God, just let it happen, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I just started reading that too, so I can't really say either way.
Yeah. And it all comes down to is that, or my opinion is, we don't see things from God's perspective, and we have no idea what. We're just seeing a glimpse in the time frame of reality. So it's it's the overwhelming answer to a lot of things, I think. But obviously, you have to come to more day-to-day answers too.
Right. What's the day-to-day of? What's my answer day-to-day? My answer can't just be, it'll work out somehow, God's got it in the background. Though that is kind of the idea, but
Yeah, and it come day to day. Your primary fallback is your faith, but you still want to have rational answers as well.
You have to be able to have a way to talk about your faith.
Yeah,
and it's not so much as you need to have a way to defend it and tell that other people how they're wrong, but it's you need to be able to, yes, defend, but just talk about it. You have to have some things thought about ahead of time, because for one, if you haven't thought about them, you can't effectively talk about them, and two, if you haven't really thought about the things that you believe, how well do you believe them? I don't know.
Valid.
So anyway, thanks for bringing that.
Yeah. Maybe in the future we can read, if I find more interesting arguments in this book, we can also bring them on the podcast.
Yeah, or other books.
Or yeah, well, any books, yeah.
I don't have much time to read books nowadays, but audiobooks.
It's just an excuse.
Audiobooks. It is just an excuse. It's kind of like a half excuse and half like...
Half-truth.
Half-truth, yeah.
Yeah, well, audiobooks are the answer.
So, kind of an unrelated note, but in some ways related, I guess, is just kind of something that I've been thinking about a little bit recently. Is actually related to like work, right? So you have a job or whatever, and what motivates you to do a job when a job, if you think about it, is mostly, it provides for physical needs,
Yeah.
It's not like a spiritual endeavor. Well, even though there are definitely opportunities that can be made through it, it's, you don't work. I mean, you might. It'd be good if you did. You don't work for a spiritual reason. Generally, you're just covering physical needs. So anyway, thinking about that and how hard should I work, when maybe I don't enjoy it, maybe it's not always the most fun. And I've been thinking a lot about some verses, which I think I had pulled up.
Okay.
In Colossians 3:22 through 24, basically. And here it's talking about slaves, but I think it really just applies to employees or people who have any form of master just as well. So it says, in all things obey those who are your masters on earth, not with external service as those who merely please men, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, do your work heartily, as for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve. So that's just kind of something that I've been thinking about recently because work has been very busy. A lot of the camera just died. A lot of late days. And it's kind of just thinking about that, like, oh man, just getting bogged down with doing it. But this verse has kind of given me the inspiration to kind of keep working hard, knowing that I'm not just doing it to make money, right? I'm not just doing it for, my boss or whatever. When it comes down to it, as the verse says, you are serving the Lord Christ, in a way.
It's interesting because you want to be as productive as you can with your time. So if all your work is to make money, then it doesn't seem as productive in as far as your walk with God. But I think it is in a way because you are developing you're still developing your character. I don't know. It's I don't know where I was going with this, but
I mean, it's a difficult balance that has to be found in a lot of things, and especially work is like, am I doing this just for physical needs? I feel like I should have spiritual reasons for this, and I should be using this as outreach, and maybe go so far as like I need to choose my job based on where I will be most effective, and that's another thing that I don't know the answer to, but I know that whatever I do find myself doing, like the verse says, I need to do it not like I'm doing it for men, not like I'm doing it for, the paycheck or whatever, but I need to do it and try to do my best job because it's as if I'm doing it for God.
Yeah.
So I guess just to give some background on this is I work as a delivery driver right now. That's my job. And
be off the tape.
And especially when it's busy, it can be very tempting to not want to do a great job at that because, you can just blame it on like, oh, the weather was bad, so I couldn't deliver all those packages. There's a lot of opportunity to not do very well, or it's like, oh man, I don't want to go all the way back there to get that one I missed. So that's kind of why I've been thinking of it, and because I'm thinking like, I don't just think of it as like, I'm not just thinking about myself as in like, oh man, do I want to do it or not? Because I generally just try not to base decisions based off my own preference alone. So,
I've dealt with this too because it's more like I think this is important for me to think about because sometimes at work I'm just thinking about what is the bare minimum I needed to do to make sure the managers are happy. Like, because sometimes I feel like I'm overworked and overstressed, so it's like, okay.
Overworked, underpaid.
Well, not underpaid, but it's like, what are the managers most likely to care about? And maybe if I sacrifice other things in order to achieve that. And so, but let's take a step back and really think about why am I doing this and who should I really be trying to please?
Mm-hmm.
Because, and don't cut corners, I guess.
Well, on a similar note to that, it's just like anyone who gets like really good grades in school or something, especially in college, the secret is not that they're really smart; it's that they know what the teachers want. You learn what they want, and then you do it, and then they're happy. And we can do the same thing at work, and we're not actually, if it's in school, we're not actually really learning anything. If it's the job, we're maybe not actually doing a good job, but it looks like we're doing a good job to the people who we think it's important.
But it's not. It might not be completely ethical, or not necessarily ethical, but it might not be completely honest.
And
or we might not be completely honest with ourselves, even.
Right, because as humans, we are very tempted to want to explain away things that we do, be like, I find myself sometimes just like, I'll do like multiple times. I'll be like, oh, well, no, I could do it for this reason. Maybe it's something that like, I know I probably should do it, but I kind of don't want to, like, oh man, do I really want to go get this way out there, stop, deliver this package? It's like, I could, I come up with like multiple reasons why not to do it. And I have to like stamp them down one by one and be like, no, just gotta do it.
The people need their Christmas presents.
Yeah. They need their Walmart boxes.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say brands. So anyway, that's just, something I've been thinking about. I don't know the exact answer to it besides pretty much do what the verse says.
Yeah.
As much as I can do while being honest to do my best job,
And kind of what something I like to go back to is the early church. As far as like, what are we doing and who is it and like where is our time spent? Because obviously in the early church there was people that were full-time missionaries, and I think that wasn't too uncommon. But there were also people that had regular jobs, and they were both really active in the church, and they also supported those who were full-time missionaries. And so even though they weren't out there all the time, they were just as important in that church as those people who were. And so they were working for God just the same way, because without missionary support, or without support for the missionaries can't do their job.
Right.
And I think the difference is between those people and probably a lot of people that have regular jobs and go to church today is that they were thinking about the church first and what the church needed. A lot of them probably before thinking about what they needed.
Right.
So if you work but you don't think of your money as your money, I think that's the difference.
Or your time is your time.
Yeah.
Or your stuff is your stuff.
Yeah, you're working, but your time is not for you; it's for God. So if you're working, then you should be working to help further God's kingdom. Whether that's doing mission work or whether that's paying for somebody else to do mission work, it's all for the same goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a very easy trap that I fall into a lot. Is the using language like my time, or it's my, because it always makes me feel like I have like this right to it, like if it's mine, like how dare something else get in the way? How dare someone else try to, steal it from me, or how,
Yeah.
And that's it's just it's in general just a bad way to think about it, because it leads to us being less generous with our time and definitely more selfish. That's how it is for me.
Yeah. It's interesting because that kind of goes along with like I like to consider myself, and I want to be an essentialist, as far as it's like a minimalist, except for it's more to do with your priorities.
Mm-hmm.
But the catch in that is you shouldn't be an essentialist for your sake. You should be an essentialist for the sake of God, or for God's kingdom. And so I've tried in my life, I've tried to install habits where I don't take on more than I can handle with projects or volunteering to do things or agreeing to do things. But the catch in that is, and what I need to work on, is that the reason for that is not so that I can have more time to do what I want to do. It's so I can serve God more.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you can be both an essentialist and serve God more. It just, maybe we should start to wrap it up. Let's see if we can come up with any closing thoughts off the top of our heads. So this week's episode was about primarily the prosperity gospel, which I think is a very important topic, especially in America, because America, I think, is the biggest place that struggles with it. Well, actually, all of civilized society. But
First world countries.
First world countries, yes.
Where, especially those that have, United States, especially because we have, complete religious freedom, pretty much. And
most first world countries do to some extent. They may be less. They may have some restrictions, but none of them are anything what compared to like what China has, or for example.
Isn't China a first world? I don't know.
Yeah, but they still have religious persecution.
Okay, right. So that's the kicker right there.
Yeah. Well, it's the combination of two things. It's one, persecution of the church, and two, financial. Well,
Exposure. So we talked quite a bit about that. We talked about the video by Wayne Cordiero.
It's kind of tied into that as well.
And had some good thoughts there. We also talked about kind of the question of like how can there be a loving God and yet still there be a lot of pain and suffering in the world, and kind of talked about some potential arguments either way.
Yeah.
That's something that you can always elaborate on. Any other thoughts?
That should be it. We will see you in next week's episode of the Salt of the Earth podcast,
Where we will talk about... We don't know what we'll talk about.